Okay, the next set of major concepts, and really the main one, is the idea of the unconscious. And instead of the id, ego, superego, Jung felt that we had a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. And this is really the major point where they divided. The personal unconscious contains forgotten and painful memories, experiences, and subliminal perception. And it pretty much aligned with Freud's idea of the unconscious. So it's basically the same ideas. However, he felt we also had a collective unconscious. And these were impersonal or transpersonal sort of unconscious parts of us. They're universal. And they're not rooted in our own personal experience, but rather shared with all humans. And this is really where his spiritual, mystical, occult, anthropological ideas came into play, because his collective unconscious contains sort of the memories of humans. It's mainly symbolic, or shows up in symbols and what we call archetypes, which is what we're going to talk about next. But just think of the power of this, that we not only have sort of our own memories, but we carry sort of this collective unconscious of humanity that's shared by people throughout the world. And he felt that we saw this sort of come out in art and folk stories and religions, because it's all a lot of the same themes and symbols and characters from people that have never met each other. And so he explained it as this sort of, collective unconscious, right? And it wasn't something that was biologically determined, because it was shared by all humanity. So it's really a fascinating idea. So he felt that we are born with a psychological heritage as well as a biological heritage. And I put this quote here because it really sort of sums up that saying, that just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with it a long evolutionary period behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. It can no more be a product without history than is the body in which it exists. And no, he didn't write this in 1964. This book was published in 1964. Obviously, he died before that. So if you think about what did we know about the brain, in the 30s, 20s and 30s, we didn't know a whole, this is lobotomy time, right? So we didn't know a whole lot. That he just had this foresight, and he just knew that there was some connection that we passed down, not just our biology, our genetics, my mom had diabetes, so I have diabetes, but that we pass down our psychology also, that how our mind works. And during this time, we're looking at the idea of the conscious and the unconscious, so it makes sense, he would say, we pass down these things. And now we know that a lot of psychological disorders, or at least the risk of them, is inherited. So that goes with disorders, but he's talking mainly about personality. All right. Where are we? Next slide. Okay, let's move on to the archetypes. Now, archetypes are figures, situations, and personality structure. He felt that the archetypes are a pattern that channels our psychic energies, that these are the core ideas of how people think about the world, both consciously and unconsciously, and they appear in dreams, fantasies, mythology, modern literature. They're often symbolic, so they're not always people, right? Like snakes always sort of play a sinister role in stories, but they're inherited predispositions to respond to the world in certain ways. And he based this on his work in anthropology and art and literature and spirituality, as you said earlier. So the patterns are based in mythical and religious situation and figures. So some examples of sort of the typical archetypes are like the hero's quest, right? This is the situational archetype. There's 3 different sort of categories: figures, situations, and personality structure, right? So the archetypes are broken down into figures, situations, and personality structure. One of the examples of a situation would be the hero's quest. right? That the hero is going to, do something grand in order to, save the people or win over the maiden or please the king or whatever it is, right? The old sage would be an example of a figure archetype. And this is sort of the old wise person, right? Doesn't have to be male, female, but it's someone that's wise, and they're usually an elder. And then an example of a personality archetype is the shadow. And so we're going to talk about each of the personality types separately. So I want you to understand this difference, that archetypes come in 3 categories: figures, situations, and personality structure. Most of what we're going to talk about in our class and in the case study you're going to work on is the archetype related to personality structure. So that's what I want you to focus on. All right, let's see. So when we're considering the personality type archetypes, there are 5, right, parts. This is the structure forming elements within the unconscious. So this is what makes up the unconscious. And these give rise to archetypal images that dominate both individual fantasy life and the mythologies of an entire culture. The structure serves to organize psychological material. It's how we deal with the world, according to Jung. Instead of id, ego, superego, we have ego, persona, shadow, anima or animus, and self. Jung felt these were carriers of energy. Just like psychoanalysis, it's based on energy, right? In psychoanalysis, it was sort of the energy of holding back the unconscious. Jung saw the archetypes as, when activated, they unlock a tremendous amount of energy. And the therapy with Jung would be to sort of balance these archetypes. One of the assignments that we do sometimes in class is to think about what has been the major archetypal image or theme in your life. In what ways has it influenced you and those around you, and then give examples. To think about how archetypes are meaningful. Think about themes in literature and films that you like. What type of movies do you like to watch? Do you like to watch rom-coms, right? Do you like to watch, action movies? Do you find a particular character really captivating? These would be sort of how archetypes play in your life. Now, all right, so let's look at this structure of the personality by Jung. So here you have sort of the traditional representation of the conscious and unconscious, where the persona and ego are mainly conscious. Now remember, the ego for Freud was sort of both conscious and unconscious. Jung, they're both conscious. We'll talk about what each of these are. In the unconscious would be the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self. So let's go through. I have 2 sort of pictures here. These are really old, from old publications from the 60s, but it's the main ones used for Jung because a lot of people were studying his work at that time. So let's go through each of these personality archetypes. The first 2 we're looking at are the ego and the persona. The ego is the center of consciousness. The ego provides a sense of consistency and direction and is completely conscious, derived from personal experience, right? The persona is sort of the mask we put on. It's called the conformity archetype, right? This is part of your personality. It's the appearance you present to the world. It's the social roles you hold, the clothes you wear, your individual style. But a dominant persona can smother the individual if you're consistently having to put on a mask. And we're not talking about code switching, although that would be a really interesting direction to go with this theory. Another plug for Psych 222 there. But instead, sort of just how we appear to the world are the roles that we play. Are we the caretaker? Are we the, everyone's friend? Are we the party girl? Are we the cool aunt? Are we the, bodybuilder guy? Like whatever it is that we present to the world, if that becomes too dominant in our life, it can smother sort of the individual. If any of the archetypes get too strong, it impacts our psychological health. All right. The shadow is sort of, now we're going into the unconscious. The shadow is the focus for repressed material, tendencies, desires, rejected memories. It's like the gremlin. It's like that voice in your head, that negative voice. It contains all the negative tendencies we try or we wish to deny. It's most dangerous when not organized. And once it is brought into consciousness, it loses power but never disappears. So one of the goals of therapy with Jung is to bring the shadow out, to confront the shadow, to, personify it. Now we're going to get to the two sort of more difficult ones. These are all sort of easy. Ego, center of consciousness, persona, the mask we put on, shadow, the dark part of us, the repressed part, the pain. So let's go to the anima and the animus. This is really one of the most fascinating ones and difficult to understand. So we're going to spend a little time here. The anima and the animus are both within us. And depending on if you identify as male or female, you have an anima or an animus. Now, we are looking at sort of the classic definitions, so we're going to get to that. But to start with, Jung believed the psyche is both feminine and masculine, that it is inherently androgynous, regardless of what the gender the physical person is, that we had this balance, this yin and yang within us. Your personality or your persona naturally takes on the gender role that you are born to physically. So if you're born physically a woman, you would take on a female gender role. Now we know that this is not always how it happens, but this is the general default orientation when we're looking at this from a classic perspective. Out of all the theorists that we look at, Jung is the most, I think, broad-minded as far as understanding the range of human experience. So I don't want you to knock him for having this genderized idea, because really it's that the psyche was not gendered, but that we had these sort of forces within us. So from this classical perspective, women would have a contrasexuality, an alternate side, which is masculine in nature, and this is called the animus. The animus is the idea or prototype of the man, of a male, as held in the mind of a female. And the opposite for a man would have an anima, which is the idea or prototype of the female as held in the mind of the male. And Jung felt that the child's opposite sex parent is a major influence on the development of the anima or animus. It's sort of like the essential being a woman. If you're a boy, a lot of times your mom is sort of the, your idea of a good woman, right? Even if it's not your mom, there's some female you can say represents sort of, a good woman in your perspective. Okay. This archetype is one of the most influential regulators of behavior. It appears in dreams, fantasies, usually as figures, obviously, of the opposite sex. And it functions as the primary mediator between the unconscious and conscious processes. It's oriented primarily towards the inner processes, right? That's why it's mainly more unconscious, just as a persona is more oriented to the outer, right? For example, the creative influence of the anima can be seen in male artists who have traditionally attributed their inspiration to the muses, right? Female demigoddesses. Jung also called this archetype the soul image because it has the capacity to bring us in touch with our unconscious forces. It's often the key to unlocking our creativity, knowing the feminine side of us or knowing the masculine side of us. So there's a lot of research on the anima and animus. I hope I haven't already confused you, but I'm going to give you an example. Hopefully it'll help straighten it out a little bit. So an example of an animus would be Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White being a female, which therefore her archetype would be an animus, and the seven dwarfs are all animus manifestations, psychologically speaking. I said sleeping as I'm looking at sleepy there. Meaning that Snow White is asleep. She's dreaming access to the unconscious, and in her unconscious are sort of her representations of how she sees men, right? The male side of her. And these are all animus manifestations, the masculine side that men take on. These sort of her vision of masculinity. Animus is the self, and the self is the most important part of our personality. It is the union between conscious and unconscious, embodies the harmony and balance of various opposing elements of the psyche. The self appears impersonally in dreams and in fantasy, as like a circle, a mandala, a crystal, a stone. Remember, it's sort of the unity of everything. Or it can appear personally, like a royal couple, a divine child. And the development of the self is the goal of individuation, which is sort of our psychological process, what we go through. Our goal is to access and develop the self, sort of an integrated, full personality. Okay, so how the heck do you do that, right? One of the ways to move through your archetypes, to visit your archetypes, is through guided visualization, to start to access what they are, who they mean to you, how they play a role in your life. Because remember, approaching and bringing the archetype, your personal, right, personality archetypes into your conscious are one way of allowing them not to dominate your life and to get closer to individuation, sort of this goal, right, a psychological goal of wholeness. One of the methods used is dream interpretation, right, because very similar to Freudian theory, where he used dreams to access the unconscious, so did Jung, but he didn't see them as so confusing. He saw dreams as pretty straightforward, that there wasn't this manifest and latent content, but all of it represented symbols, that the unconscious expresses itself mainly through symbols. And so the symbols are there in the dream. You don't have to say that the symbol means something else. You just have to understand what the symbol represents. That's kind of the same thing, right? But the closer the symbol conforms around an archetype, the stronger the response. There are two types of symbols: individual, which are natural, spontaneous productions of the individual psyche, or collective. Collective, remember, relating to the collective unconscious, are often religious images. So these come out in dreams, and they, with the help of your analyst, your Jungian analyst, you then interpret the symbols in your dreams. So what does the dream say? If we're looking at dream interpretation, which always seems to be a popular topic, we want to know, what do our dreams mean, right? And Jung really moved away from free association on dreams. He felt that just using free association, just as talking about whatever comes to your mind, would bring out complexes, but not the symbolism of dreams or the meaning. So he really wanted to focus more on the image and symbols in the dream. What does that represent? Dreams deal with symbols that usually have more than one meaning. And the dreamer interprets the dream with the help of the analyst. But that dreams are living realities. And if you can befriend your dreams and treat them as communication from the unconscious, you get farther into understanding your unconscious world, right? So it's not to be scared of dreams, but to acknowledge their worth, befriend them, and use them as how your unconscious is trying to communicate with you. Not it's telling the future, right? Not it's, just random things going through your mind as other, dream theory has, newer dream theory. Not that it's, has this complete other meaning, but that the symbols represent something. You just have to figure out what they represent. All right. Jeremy Taylor, who's a well-known authority on Jungian dream work, postulates certain basic assumptions about dreams. And one goal, if you'd like to do dream interpretation for yourself, is to keep a dream journal. Always write down your dreams as much as you can remember. The more you start writing them down, the more you'll be able to remember. Everyone dreams. We know that now, neuropsych standpoint. And if you're having trouble remembering your dreams, set an alarm for about 20 minutes before you usually wake up. That's generally when you're in a dream state. Not all dreams happen in REM. There are dreams in non-REM also. And then at the end of the week, after kind of collecting a bunch of dreams, look for patterns or symbolism. Does something keep coming up? Draw pictures of the symbols and images in your dreams. Remember that language of dreams is one of symbols and metaphors. It's not going to be straightforward. The same dream may have several meanings. And as you consider your dreams and dream images, ask yourself, what does this dream have to say to me? So Taylor felt that all dreams come in the service of health and wholeness, right? Even scary dreams are there to provide some communication. That no dream comes simply to tell the dreamer what he or she already knows. Right? It's not just repeating known information. There's a deeper symbolic meaning to it. That only the dreamer can say with certainty what meanings a dream may hold. It's not the analyst telling you what they mean, like Freud did. Right? It's the analyst helping you understand the symbols. There's no such thing as a dream with only one meaning. And all dreams speak a universal language, a language of metaphor and symbols. So you're looking for the symbols. And remember, it's not just a circle on the wall, kind of symbol. The people in the dream, how do they represent archetypes? How do they represent parts of your personality archetypes? Are they a representation of your shadow, of your anima or animus, right? Are they religious symbols, mythical symbols? Right? Do they represent other situation archetypes like the hero's quest, the maiden's longing for her lover, the person that, the hero's quest in a modern sense of struggle and making it, right? Leaving your family, going off to forge your own path, becoming an entrepreneur and being successful. That's sort of the modern hero's quest. So these are sort of the themes you want to look for in your dreams. Now, dream interpretation is just one path to individuation, but individuation is always the goal, and this is psychological growth. So self-development or unfolding of our basic nature is a fundamental drive in Jungian theory that he felt, much like Maslow, who you're going to read about in the next chapter, feels that we're all sort of pushed towards self-actualization. Jung felt that we're all sort of have this drive towards individuation, to this psychological wholeness, right, of the self. This process of achieving wholeness and moving towards greater freedom is sort of fundamental. And that as we get farther towards individuation, our archetypes start to be more subtle. They don't rule our life so much. And this all includes creating a dynamic relationship between the ego, right, which is the conscious, and the self, the true essence of who we are. The integration of all the parts of the psyche, the ego and self, the persona, shadow, anima or animus, and then the other archetypes is the goal of individuation. And it's so crazy because if you think about, and I know we don't talk about this in this course, but if you're taking abnormal, we learn about DID, dissociative identity disorder, split or multiple personalities is what they used to call it. And the goal, they use mainly psychodynamic therapy to treat this because it's a split, the movie Split, right? It's a splitting of the personality into multiple personalities to deal with some trauma that happened. And the goal of the therapy is to integrate the personalities back into the host person. It is like we all have this within us, but when we experience extreme ongoing, repeated trauma, generally some sort of abuse, that we become so splintered that our psyche splinters off and our archetypes, if we're looking at it from a Jungian perspective, become so strong, overwhelmingly strong, they take over our ego and our self and our persona. Our persona becomes the archetype. And to heal this personality, we have to bring them all back together. We all have a little bit of this in us. right? It's not clinically diagnosed because we don't all have DID, but we all have sort of this base of our personality. And to become a stronger, or have stronger psychological awareness is to bring all these parts together. I just think it's the most beautiful. I just love it. I really love Jungian theory and therapy. Okay, so how do you do this? First is to unveil the persona. You've got to know what you're putting out there, right? You got to understand why you present yourself the way you do. And you have to sort of open that up as to why you're doing that. You've got to learn to view it as a useful tool rather than an essential part of ourselves. Like, you don't have to be whatever it is that you put out there, right, as your persona. That is just a tool you use. You need to start to confront the shadow, accept the dark side of you, right? And what's in there and what it represents and how it holds you back. Confront the anima or the animus, the masculine or feminine parts of you, and deal with it as a real person that we can learn from. That representation, that archetype has a message for you. It could be you need to integrate more of that part into your, individuate, right? Bring that part more into your conscious awareness, that you have to confront. How did this get to be who it is? Why is it this is our ideal representation? So is Jung saying that we should all sort of integrate and individuate into an androgynous, non-gender identifying person? I'll leave that there. Develop the self. The goal, or this is the goal or culmination of this process. The self is our life's goal. It is the integration of all of these archetypes, of understanding them, accepting them, learning from them, and not allowing them to sort of overtake who we are as a person. So this is not exactly the easiest process, that people can get stuck. First of all, the ego, right? That's the conscious part, got to be strong enough to undergo the change. Like, you have to be strong enough to say, ooh, yeah, that little voice inside of me makes me kind of moody, and I snap at people too much, and I get mad at stuff that maybe I shouldn't get mad at. I need to deal with that. That's my gremlin, right? And he's just a little too strong sometimes. How do I manage him? The danger of identification with the persona, of just trying to be perfect and unable to accept any failures, is part of the persona. And you have to learn that that is just the mask you're putting on. You have to take off that mask and learn about who that person is behind that mask. Confronting the anima or animus may produce sudden emotional changes or moodiness. All right? You're dealing with parts of you that have historically been pretty repressed. And to accept those and communicate with those is difficult. It's, raw feelings and emotions that can be beyond who you are individually, but be part of a collective unconscious of humanity that can be powerful and overwhelming. Ego inflation could result in a person trying to be more and less than they really are. So these are just obstacles to growth within the therapy. But this therapy is a joint effort between the analyst and the patient, working together as equals. Another divide between Jung and Freud. Freud was the pro, the expert, and he told you what you were dreaming about, and he interpreted it for you. In Jungian therapy, you're working together as equals. Again, this is sort of like transitioning into some of the humanistic ideas that we're going to see. There has to be an intermingling of the therapist and client at an unconscious level. And that's really different. If you think about any of the therapies that we've talked about or will talk about, this idea of intermingling on an unconscious level, is different. So I won't go into, we're already hitting, longer than I wanted, but major stages of therapy. There are 2 stages to this type of therapy. It's called analytic stage and a synthetic stage. The analytic stage is the confession and elucidation stage. It's where we uncover the unconscious material, Ties to the therapist develop at this stage. So transference, which is something you read about in chapter 10, is how we see what we put onto the therapist. Those things start to come out. The elucidation is a greater understanding of the psychic process starting to develop. The patient, however, remains dependent on the therapist during this stage. After going through this, you move to the synthetic stage, where we move from psychological insight to actual new experiences that result in individual growth and the formation of new habits. And then transformation is the relationship with the analyst is integrated, the dependence is reduced, right? And you're moving closer to individuation. Now, this doesn't happen in a few sessions. This is, again, a very long-term therapy with multiple, sessions, usually per week. But they do use free association still in some parts. Dream analysis, obviously. Catharsis, that's sort of being stuck, right? The use of art, word association, those are a little newer as far as within Jungian theory. They're used, not so much in psychoanalysis. And the interpretation of transference is still also used. All right. I hope that this little glimpse into Jungian therapy and theory was interesting for you. That is our end of Jung. I mean, this could be probably a 3-hour lecture, but thank you so much for hanging in there with me in this crazy video.